Jack Lukosius has made his way via trade from the Gold Coast Suns to the Port Adelaide Power. Is this the missing piece of their forward line puzzle that's going to help them break the drought and get back into that grand final match? For the Suns, they paid a heavy draft price to recruit him initially, but are they happy to let him go? While for AFL Fantasy, SuperCoach, DreamTeam, and Keeper players in 2025, what does it mean for us in the fantasy footy community for 2025 and beyond? Hey, it's MJ from the Coaches Panel. I hope you've enjoyed this series so far. If you haven't gone back and checked out all the other players that we've reviewed so far, you can do that wherever you're checking in and tuning in on this channel. Jack Lukosius was highly rated as a junior. It was no surprise he was taken so early in that super draft. His skill set, especially by foot, and his ability to make decisions, his field kicking is absolutely amongst some of the most elite I've ever seen from a junior coming through. And it's why the Suns picked him so early, as they saw this beautiful user of the ball, left and right side of the body, where he could pinpoint passes 45, 55, 60 meters out, depending on where he was positioned across the ground. His versatility was so highly desirable to the Suns, and he was a reasonable lead-up mark as well, and interceptor. So I understand why the Suns were so keen on him in that super draft, because as a tall player, he did and does do things that so many players of his height just can't do. And so he's a credit to himself for being able to develop that skill set. And it's why the Suns wanted him so badly. Unfortunately, it's just not really landed for him at Gold Coast. And maybe we start at the Gold Coast Suns. What does this mean for them? Well, politely, Damien Hardwick squeezed him out of this team, not just by telling him to explore his trade options, but by dropping him out of the side in these final few weeks of the year. It was very, very clear that under a Damien Hardwick coached Gold Coast Suns, there was no space for him. They trialled him forward, they trialled him back, they trialled him forward, they pushed him up even across the wings to varying degrees. But under Damien Hardwick, it's clear they felt he was positionless. And as a result, happy to see him go. And I think that's the big concern before we talk about what it means for Port Adelaide. I think that's the really big concern, is he has been trialled at both ends of the ground and everything in between, from a transition side of things through the wings. And he's never really completely looked and landed at home. There's been moments where he's been forward for the Suns and you're like, oh, this is going to click here. And kicks bags of 3, 4, 5 goals and leads up well and takes some nice marks, and you think this is going to work. And then the next 2, 3, not just weeks, but months, unfortunately for Jack, it just doesn't come together. Then they throw him into the back line and his distribution and ball use looks really clean and crisp. But then defensively, at times, he's been a little bit of a liability and players kind of get off and away from him and teams score goals through Jack Lukosius. So I feel horrible for him because he's just never really had a chance to get settled at either position. And my concern is this: if he can't find himself settled soon, I believe that will happen at Port Adelaide, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But if he can't get settled soon, there's a little bit of Jack Watts about this. Highly talented, highly skilled, highly drafted, but never really finds a position that they own and can call their own. And all of a sudden, their versatility becomes their downfall, and they never truly become anything more than a nice AFL level player. And if he was picked in the 30s or 40s, I don't think anyone would have any knock on that. But because you get picked at such a high area of the draft and now sent to another club where the pressure is going to be arguably more intense in South Australia than it is at Gold Coast in terms of the media landscape and focus, I do have some concern. I hope he can. I really do. Jack's one of my favourite players to watch playing the game when he's at his best. But I do have a little bit of concern that if he can't find his feet and he can't find his preferred position on the field, that he'll just be a Jack Watts type. A nice player, but unfortunately will get slammed in media circles for not living up to his full potential. So where does he play at Port Adelaide? Well, politely, Jack's wanted and views himself as a forward. He doesn't see himself as any other position on the ground, but rather a forward that can lead up, take nice marks, impact the scoreboard with his clean and efficient set shots at goal, and then set plenty up with his elite field kicking. I know sometimes we use that term in the footy media and the fantasy footy media landscape, elite, just really kind of carelessly, but absolutely. You want to talk about elite skills with both sides of his body by foot, Jack sits in that conversation. Port Adelaide's forward line did not get functioning consistently in 2024. Arguably, it's the one part of their field that you feel is weakest. It's why they moved Asava Radagalia forward while they paid a hefty price for him in the back line. They moved him forward because they needed that. Charlie Dixon, who's now retired, gave us a couple of quarters throughout the year, maybe the odd game where it looked like the Charlie of old. And Mitch Georgiadis is just coming back into the fold, really. Todd Marshall, unfortunately, concussions are building up. And at time of recording, it's not even sure when we might see him back at an AFL level. That is the fear internally at the club. And so what they've done here, Port Adelaide, is recruit a player that sees himself and playing at his best in the forward line and adding him to their forward line. What he'll do is he'll add a nice piece, well, not a contested marking player. He'll add a nice piece to this Port Adelaide forward line. I actually think the fact that he's not a bomb it on top of his head style and type of player like Charlie Dixon was, this is actually the very thing that Port Adelaide need. So often one of the criticisms that power fans would have on their team is we've got one way of playing the game, which is win the ball at the contest with our elite midfield and then just chuck it on the head of our forwards and expect them to do the hard work. But with a player like a Lukosius, that ball is just going to flip straight back out. And while he can take overhead and contested marks, he is at his best moving into space, creating separation from his defender with that nice kind of 3 to 5 meter turn of breakout speed, and then getting on the lead and taking a mark. His skill set, Georgiades, is very, very similar. While he can take contested, you want him running and creating space and separation. I think if Port Adelaide played to the strengths of the forwards that they now have with these two, with Whitley Rioli, it actually could fix the biggest deficiency that I think Port Adelaide have, which is their mindset of how they bring the ball inside forward 50. So the arrival of Lukosius, I've got high hopes for Jack and high hopes for Port Adelaide that he could be the central mindset change that just unlocks this team from bombing it on the head in the forward line and hoping Big Charlie gets it to now we don't have that style of player. We have to play and kick the ball to the strengths of our forwards to see us impact the games and get ourselves into premiership contention. We're getting into that grand final and making some slight adjustments to our game style. I think if they can do that, and Lukosius being central to that, well, I think this adds some great forward pressure, some forward presence, and great forward structure of how they get the ball. This could be an absolute game changer for Port Adelaide if all those things land. It's a lot of ifs, I know, but that's what we're talking about in the preseason and off-season, a lot of ifs. From a fantasy footy perspective, politely, Jack's a 60 to 70 guy in terms of average across the formats. That's what his average was this year, in the low 60s in fantasy, high 60s in SuperCoach. And you go back through his career, he's floating between low 60s to mid 70s across the format. Knows AFL Fantasy tons last year, a 91, a 129 in SuperCoach was his only ton in that format last year. My concern from a fantasy perspective is he has put on his best level of scoring consistency and scoring ceiling when he's played off that halfback position. I don't see him, and I don't think, even with the departures that they might be seeing in the other parts of the field for Port Adelaide, I still think and completely believe the only place he will play is in the forward line. And as a result, I just have no classic interest whatsoever. And politely in draft 2, I don't want to touch any part of Jack Lukosius as a on draft day option unless it's a super, super deep draft. And we are talking like squads of 40 and 12 coaches per league, like massive depth. To me, he's a waiver wire pick that you go and plug and play depending on the opponent that they're coming up against. So when they come up against a West Coast, for example, okay, well, now I'm really interested. A Richmond, for example. Okay, now I'm a little bit interested based on the opposition. But as a general rule of thumb, Jack's not someone I want to field in my salary cap side or in my drafts. But do you agree or disagree on my take, not just from a fantasy perspective, but a positional and how important a move this could be for Port Adelaide? And for Gold Coast, I don't think many were going to disagree with my take. But regardless, if you're watching this as a YouTube video, comment below and let me know your thoughts about Jack Lukosius and the implications for 2025. If you're listening to this as an audio podcast and you haven't given a 5-star rating yet, the good news is it's not too late. You can get in touch with us across social media and join the conversation about Jack and all the players that have moved clubs this off-season so far. All the details for our social media you can find in the description of this episode. It's also got the links to join our Patreon. They've got a couple of episodes of our top 50 keeper ranks podcast. They are out now for Patreons of all tiers, as well as access to our merch. Plenty of people are getting on board. We launched at the start of the trade and free agency period, and tons of people have been able to pick it up. If you want to join them and rep the coaches panel in 2025, you can click on the link in the description of this episode and get your hands on some coaches panel merch. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in and checking out our review on Jack Lukosius. More players reviewed in the trade and free agency period. If you haven't caught up on those episodes, you can. But we can't wait to be back with you very, very soon, talking about all the player movements and the next player that moves clubs in the trade and free agency period.